Stop right there. I said stop.
Officer, I'm exiting a federal courthouse. What is the issue?
Don't argue with me. You're being detained for disorderly conduct.
On what grounds? I have committed no violation.
Turn around. Hands behind your back. Now.
You are arresting a sitting judge. This will have consequences.
Judge Elaine Brooks was not a name spoken lightly in legal circles. For more than 2 decades, her presence on the bench had carried weight, not through theatrics or intimidation, but through calm authority earned the long way. She was the kind of judge attorneys prepared for carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect. Every word she spoke in court was measured, every ruling deliberate, every pause intentional. In her early 60s, Judge Brooks carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. She had spent years as a federal prosecutor before ever wearing a robe, handling cases that demanded discipline, restraint, and an unshakable commitment to the law. Colleagues often described her as firm but fair, demanding but humane. She believed deeply that justice was not about volume or force. It was about balance, clarity, and accountability. Court staff knew her routine well. She arrived early, left without ceremony, and never sought attention. There were no entourages, no dramatic exits. On most days, she walked out of the courthouse the same way she entered it. Upright, composed, her case notes tucked neatly under her arm, her expression thoughtful but untroubled. To her, it was simply the end of another workday. That afternoon was no different. The hearings had concluded on time. No disruptions. No raised voices. No tension lingering in the halls. Judge Brooks stepped through the courthouse doors with the steady gait of someone accustomed to order. Her pace was unhurried. Her posture relaxed. There was nothing about her movement that suggested urgency, defiance, or concern. This was the woman who had spent years instructing others on lawful conduct. The woman who reminded attorneys of decorum, who corrected officers when procedures were overstepped, who embodied the idea that the rule of law applied evenly to everyone. And yet, in a moment that would later feel painfully surreal, that very embodiment of restraint was about to be confronted by something altogether different. The irony was sharp enough to sting. A judge who had dedicated her life to enforcing constitutional boundaries would soon find herself tested by the very system she trusted. Where she carried dignity, she would be met with aggression. Where she expected professionalism, she would encounter suspicion. And where there should have been recognition, there would instead be resistance. Nothing about her routine had changed. Only the response to it would. And that contrast between who Judge Elaine Brooks was and how she was about to be treated would become impossible to ignore. That morning had unfolded with the kind of predictability Judge Elaine Brooks valued. The docket was full but manageable, the cases familiar in rhythm if not in detail. A series of routine hearings moved through her courtroom without incident. Motions argued, evidence reviewed, procedural matters resolved. No raised voices. No defiance. No tension that lingered beyond the final gavel. When court recessed, there was no sense that anything extraordinary had occurred. By early afternoon, Judge Brooks gathered her files, exchanged brief, professional nods with court staff, and exited chambers as she had done thousands of times before. The courthouse itself was calm. Security officers were stationed at their usual posts, assigned to general oversight rather than any specific threat. There were no alerts over the radio, no elevated posture among personnel, no whispered urgency in the halls. It was an ordinary day in a building designed for order. Outside, the courthouse plaza reflected that same calm. Lawyers lingered on the steps finishing phone calls. Clerks crossed the walkway toward nearby offices. A few members of the public waited quietly on benches. Nothing suggested unrest. Nothing demanded intervention. No one was being followed. No disturbance had been reported that morning, and none would be recorded afterward. The officers present were not responding to a call. They had not been dispatched for an altercation, nor were they acting on any immediate concern. Their role that day was simple: visibility, routine security, a reassuring presence meant to maintain the peace rather than disrupt it. There was no emergency requiring decisive action. There was no suspect description circulating. There was no reason, on paper or in practice, for escalation. Judge Brooks stepped into this environment unaware that she stood out in any way. To her, it was just another courthouse exit, another transition from the formality of the bench to the quiet of a late afternoon. She had made this walk countless times without incident, often passing the same officers without more than a courteous acknowledgement. And yet, what would follow could not be explained as a reaction to chaos or a response to danger. It would not be justified by confusion or urgency. The absence of any triggering event made the moment sharper, more troubling. Because when there is no disruption, no complaint, no call for action, a question inevitably surfaces, one that cannot be ignored. Why her? Why now? And what, exactly, prompted a decision that would soon echo far beyond the courthouse steps? The moment unfolded quickly, but not suddenly. As Judge Elaine Brooks crossed the plaza, her attention was fixed on nothing more than the path ahead, until a sharp command cut through the air behind her. "Ma'am, stop right there." She turned, surprised but composed, assuming at first it was a procedural question, perhaps a misplaced visitor needing direction. Instead, she was met with an officer already closing the distance, his tone firm, his posture rigid. "I need you to remain where you are," he said, louder now, as if volume itself created authority. Judge Brooks paused, calmly, deliberately. "Officer," she replied, "may I ask what this is regarding?" The response did not answer the question. "You failed to comply with a lawful order." Her brow tightened slightly, not in anger, but in confusion. "I'm not aware of any order," she said evenly. "Could you clarify, please? And may I have your badge number?" That request seemed to ignite something. The officer spoke over her before she finished the sentence, his voice rising, sharp, impatient. "You don't get to ask questions right now. You were told to stop." "I did stop," Judge Brooks said, her voice steady, unshaken. "I'm attempting to understand." "You're not in charge here," he cut in, stepping closer. "You're failing to comply." The exchange drew attention. Nearby officers shifted uneasily. A few courthouse staff slowed their steps. Judge Brooks straightened, instinctively grounding herself in the formalities she had upheld for decades. "My name is Judge Elaine Brooks," she said clearly. "I serve in this courthouse. I am requesting an explanation for this detention." The words landed, and were ignored. "I don't care who you say you are," the officer snapped. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." There was no resistance. No raised hands in protest. No attempt to flee or argue further. Judge Brooks did not pull away as the officer reached for her arm. She did not shout. She did not plead. Her compliance was immediate, almost reflexive, born of a lifetime spent respecting procedure, even when it failed her. The physicality escalated anyway. Her arm was pulled tighter than necessary. The cuffs came out quickly, too quickly. The sound of metal closing echoed sharply against the stone steps. A few officers nearby hesitated, glances exchanged, uncertainty flickering across their faces, but none intervened. Whatever doubt they felt was swallowed by hierarchy. "Is this necessary?" Judge Brooks asked, quietly now. She received no answer. Instead, the narrative hardened around her. Failure to comply. A phrase spoken as if it were self-explanatory, as if repetition made it true. In that moment, authority was no longer being enforced, it was being wielded, not to protect order, but to assert dominance. Not to clarify a situation, but to control it. And as Judge Elaine Brooks was led away in handcuffs, without resistance and without explanation, the imbalance became impossible to deny. The handcuffs were impossible to miss. Bright metal against a dark suit, secured in full view of the courthouse steps where Judge Elaine Brooks had walked with dignity for decades. Conversations around her stopped mid-sentence. Footsteps slowed, then halted altogether. What had been an ordinary afternoon froze into disbelief. Court employees stared, unsure whether to move or look away. Some recognized her instantly. The judge who had sworn them in, who had corrected their filings with patience, who had defended professionalism as fiercely as she defended the law. A few attorneys took instinctive steps forward, voices low but urgent. "That's Judge Brooks," one said. "There's been a mistake." "Step back," the officer snapped, dismissive, his hand raised as if warding off interference. "This doesn't concern you." It concerned everyone. The bodycam captured it all. The casual authority with which the officer dismissed those who knew exactly who she was. The way he spoke about her, not to her. "You people always think your titles mean something," he muttered, not realizing, or not caring, that every word was being recorded. Judge Brooks did not respond in kind. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue her importance. She stood upright, shoulders back, breathing steady, speaking only when necessary and with careful precision. "I am fully cooperating," she said. "I am asking that this be handled appropriately." Her composure only highlighted the imbalance. Where she exercised control, the officer displayed volatility. Where she relied on clarity, he leaned on force. The contrast was stark, unsettling, and undeniable. This was not merely an arrest. It was a public stripping of dignity, carried out in a place built to uphold it. And every witness there understood the gravity of what they were seeing, whether they dared to say it out loud or not. Hours later, the handcuffs were gone, but nothing had been repaired. Judge Elaine Brooks was released without a single charge filed against her. No citation, no warning, no formal acknowledgement that the arrest should never have happened. She walked out of custody the same way she had walked out of the courthouse earlier that day, upright, composed, silent. But the damage had already been done. At the scene, there was no explanation offered, no apology, no clarification. The officers who had acted with such certainty only hours earlier now avoided eye contact. When asked what had justified the arrest, the response was vague, procedural, and rehearsed. "Standard protocol," one officer said, as if repetition could transform confusion into legitimacy. By the following morning, the department issued a brief statement echoing the same language. The incident, they claimed, had been handled appropriately. The officer involved had followed training. There was no acknowledgement of error, no admission of escalation, and certainly no recognition of the humiliation inflicted on a sitting judge in public view. Then the report surfaced. The arresting officer had documented the encounter as disorderly behavior. According to his written account, Judge Brooks had been uncooperative, argumentative, and disruptive. The words painted a picture of defiance, raised voice, refusal to comply, repeated interference with lawful commands. On paper, it read like justification. But the bodycam told a different story. The footage showed no disorder, no aggression, no resistance. It showed a woman asking questions calmly, requesting clarification, identifying herself with restraint and formality. It showed interruptions, raised voices, and escalation, but none of it came from her. The contradiction was stark, unmistakable, and deeply troubling. What became clear in that gap between footage and report was something far more serious than a bad decision in the moment. It was an attempt to rewrite reality after the fact, to retrofit authority where none existed, to transform calm into chaos with a few strategic words. And that, more than the arrest itself, set off alarms. Because when the official narrative collapses under its own evidence, it raises a red flag that cannot be ignored. Not about a single officer, but about a system willing to defend a false version of events rather than confront the truth. When the bodycam footage was finally reviewed by Internal Affairs, the narrative the department had tried to enforce began to unravel almost immediately. Every second of the encounter was scrutinized. The officer's commands, Judge Elaine Brooks' measured responses, her calm demeanor, the precise sequence of events, all laid bare in high-definition clarity. And what the footage revealed was irrefutable. There had been no raised voices from the judge, no aggressive gestures, no refusal to comply, no attempt to flee, and certainly no physical threat. Every claim of disorderly conduct crumbled under the scrutiny of a lens that recorded without bias. Judge Brooks' responses were deliberate and composed. She asked questions, identified herself, and offered full cooperation. Everything the law expected, everything an officer could have used to de-escalate rather than escalate. The bodycam captured an uncomfortable truth. The officer's authority had been wielded not to maintain order, but to intimidate, belittle, and assert control where it was entirely unearned. Cross-referencing with courthouse surveillance cameras only confirmed what the bodycam had shown. From different angles, independent footage corroborated the judge's position and behavior. Each angle reinforced her composure and the absence of any misconduct. The event, initially framed as a confrontation instigated by Judge Brooks, was now visibly the opposite. A high-ranking legal professional being wrongfully detained, publicly humiliated, and confronted aggressively by an officer wielding power without justification. As Internal Affairs dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. Previous stops by the same officer, documented across multiple complaints, revealed a troubling trend. Individuals of color, often professionals, were disproportionately targeted. Minor infractions, or even ordinary movements had been flagged as suspicious more than once, often escalating without cause. In many cases, bodycam or surveillance footage had contradicted the officer's written reports, revealing embellishments or outright fabrications. This was no isolated lapse in judgment. It was a recurring approach to law enforcement that relied on assumptions, bias, and an abuse of procedural authority. For Judge Brooks, the evidence was now an irrefutable shield. It proved her innocence beyond personal testimony. It laid bare a systemic problem within the department and offered a tangible foundation for legal action. What had started as a single, inexplicable arrest transformed into an incontrovertible case. A professional, respected judge had been detained without cause, and the misconduct was documented in multiple, corroborating layers of evidence. The video did more than show the moment. It exposed a culture, highlighted patterns of profiling, and forced the system to confront an uncomfortable truth. Justice, it seemed, could finally be pursued not through speculation, but through recorded reality. Judge Elaine Brooks did what she had spent her career teaching others to do. She acted with precision, patience, and an unshakable sense of justice. After her release, she immediately contacted seasoned civil rights attorneys, experts in holding law enforcement accountable. They reviewed the bodycam footage, surveillance video, and all available documentation, confirming what was already clear. The arrest had been baseless, humiliating, and unlawful. Every detail, the officer's escalating aggression, the dismissal of her professional credentials, the contradictions in official reports, formed a compelling case for legal action. Within weeks, a federal lawsuit was formally filed. The complaint was meticulous, grounded in constitutional protections, and supported by irrefutable evidence. It cited violations of the Fourth Amendment, unlawful seizure and detention without probable cause, as well as the 14th Amendment, asserting that Judge Brooks had been denied equal protection under the law. The filings detailed not only the immediate incident, but also the broader pattern of misconduct previously uncovered in Officer Crowe's personnel file, underscoring a systemic issue rather than an isolated error. The defendants were named explicitly: Officer Crowe, the primary aggressor; the supervising sergeant, whose lack of intervention had tacitly endorsed the escalation; the police department itself, responsible for oversight and enforcement of conduct standards; and the city government, accountable for policy, training, and systemic culture. Each defendant was presented not only as part of the immediate incident, but also as integral to the structural failures that allowed it to occur. News of the lawsuit spread quickly. Local media outlets initially reported on the arrest, highlighting the unusual circumstance of a sitting federal judge being detained on courthouse steps. Once the lawsuit was filed, national coverage amplified the story. Headlines underscored the gravity. A prominent judge publicly humiliated, systemic abuse exposed, constitutional rights potentially violated. Civil rights organizations lent support, publishing statements condemning the incident and calling for swift accountability. Public interest soared as the narrative captured attention across social media, news broadcasts, and legal circles. Commentators emphasized the stark contrast between Judge Brooks' composure and the officer's aggression, and the case became a focal point for broader discussions about racial profiling, police authority, and the protection of civil rights. What had begun as a singular, shocking event had now escalated into a national conversation about accountability, oversight, and justice. The filing of the federal lawsuit marked a turning point. The evidence was undeniable, the narrative clear, and the stakes higher than anyone had anticipated. Judge Brooks, once on the receiving end of aggression and injustice, now held the tools to challenge not just a single officer, but an entire system that had permitted, tolerated, and concealed misconduct. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation, as the first bodycam clip flickered onto the large screen at the front of the room. Every eye followed the unfolding sequence. Officer Crowe advancing toward Judge Elaine Brooks, his voice sharp and commanding, her responses measured, calm, and precise. The contrast was undeniable, stark, and impossible to ignore. The footage captured not just the encounter itself, but the subtle details, The officer's tense posture, the repeated interruptions, the physicality of the cuffs, all laid bare for everyone in the room to see. When Officer Crowe took the stand, he attempted to frame the incident differently. He spoke confidently, insisting that Judge Brooks had been uncooperative, argumentative, even aggressive. But as the body cam replayed each moment, every claim he made was contradicted in real time. His words faltered under the weight of evidence, each assertion undermined by the objective record of the encounter. Cross-examination highlighted every inconsistency: the timing of his commands, the judge's calm compliance, the lack of resistance, and the repeated interruptions that came entirely from him. Judge Brooks took the stand with quiet dignity. She spoke slowly, deliberately, letting her words land without dramatics. Her testimony was methodical. She described the day's routine, her movements, her professional interactions, and the exact sequence of the stop. She recounted the fear and confusion, not for herself, but for the people who relied on her example, the public trust, and the children who might one day look to this moment as precedent. She never raised her voice, never gestured dramatically. Her credibility, built over decades on the bench, spoke louder than any performance ever could. Expert witnesses were called to contextualize the law. Constitutional scholars and former law enforcement trainers explained the standards for a lawful stop and arrest, probable cause, reasonable suspicion, proportionality, and de-escalation. They dissected the body cam, explaining precisely where Officer Crowe's actions diverged from accepted procedure and why the arrest violated both the 4th and 14th Amendments. Jurors leaned forward as each clip played. The tension was palpable. Every reaction, every furrowed brow, every whispered comment among themselves reflected growing disbelief and mounting concern. The room collectively felt the weight of injustice, amplified by the visual clarity of the evidence. Where words might have been contested or ignored, the images were undeniable. The courtroom held its breath as the jury filed back in, the weight of anticipation pressing on every person present. Judge Elaine Brooks sat quietly, composed as ever, her hands folded calmly in front of her. When the foreperson finally stood, the words cut through the tension like a gavel striking stone. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff. The total damages awarded are $16 million. A murmur rippled through the room. Journalists scribbled notes frantically, cameras clicked, and courthouse staff exchanged stunned glances. The number itself was staggering, $16 million, but the significance extended far beyond mere figures. It represented recognition, validation, and accountability. The damages were detailed meticulously. Compensation for emotional distress endured by a sitting federal judge subjected to public humiliation. Redress for reputational harm caused by an officer's false report and the city's initial failure to intervene. Acknowledgement of constitutional violations against the 4th and 14th Amendments. And importantly, liability assigned to the city for failing to supervise and correct systemic issues within the police department. Officer Crowe, seated nearby, remained tense, his face pale. He had been removed from patrol immediately following the incident, pending internal review, and the verdict ensured that his career and credibility would face severe consequences. His actions, once shielded by hierarchy and procedure, were now exposed to public scrutiny and legal accountability. For Judge Brooks, the moment was profound but measured. She did not cheer. She did not gloat. Instead, she allowed the verdict to stand as evidence that the law, even when misapplied against her, could still function as a tool for justice. The silence that followed the reading of damages was almost deafening, a pause that carried the weight of accountability, the realization that authority misused would no longer go unchecked. City officials, legal counsel, and courtroom observers felt the gravity of the decision. It was a statement not only about one officer's misconduct, but about the necessity of systemic oversight, proper training, and the protection of civil rights for all citizens, regardless of status or race. As the courtroom slowly exhaled, cameras captured the subtle nods and restrained expressions of those present. Judge Brooks rose, acknowledging the gravity of the moment with quiet dignity. The verdict was more than monetary. It was a reaffirmation of principle. Justice, painstakingly pursued and carefully documented, had been delivered. Authority had been held accountable, and for the first time in that public, tense encounter, balance had been restored. The aftermath of the verdict sent ripples far beyond the courtroom. The city moved swiftly, though reluctantly, to implement mandatory policy changes aimed at preventing another incident like the one that had humiliated Judge Elaine Brooks. Courthouse policing protocols were rewritten from the ground up, with explicit emphasis on de-escalation, respect for professional credentials, and adherence to constitutional protections. Officers were now required to follow clear, documented procedures before detaining or arresting any individual, particularly high-profile or professional figures whose status alone did not warrant bias. Bodycam usage, previously inconsistent, became strictly enforced. Officers were mandated to activate cameras during all interactions with the public, and footage would now be routinely reviewed for compliance and accountability. The review process included regular audits by supervisors and an independent civilian oversight committee to ensure transparency. The visual record that had exposed Officer Crowe's misconduct would now serve as a safeguard for future encounters, a tangible tool to prevent abuse of authority. For Officer Crowe, the verdict marked an effective end to his law enforcement career. While official termination procedures and internal appeals could stretch for weeks, the public record, the federal lawsuit, and the jury's findings had already irreversibly damaged his credibility. Fellow officers and law enforcement administrators took notice. His reputation was permanently tarnished, a cautionary tale of the consequences of unchecked aggression and racial bias. The city itself became the focus of national scrutiny. Media outlets highlighted the case extensively, framing it not merely as an isolated incident, but as emblematic of a broader conversation about race, authority, and accountability in American policing. Civil rights organizations, legal analysts, and policy advocates cited the verdict in op-eds, panel discussions, and congressional testimonies, emphasizing the need for systemic reform. City officials, once defensive, now faced pressure to demonstrate compliance and ensure that lessons were learned, not ignored. For Judge Brooks, the personal toll was significant but mitigated by the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She had endured humiliation and fear, yet her composure and credibility remained intact. The reforms, the bodycam enforcement, and the rewriting of protocols meant that future professionals, citizens, and even high-profile officials could navigate public spaces with a reduced risk of harassment or abuse. If a sitting federal judge could be handcuffed unlawfully on the steps of her own courthouse, it sends a stark message. No one is truly immune from abuse of power. Professional status, decades of service, and public respect cannot shield anyone from bias or profiling. Body cams, while intended to safeguard, do not prevent misconduct, they reveal it. Accountability rarely arrives immediately. It comes only after exposure, persistence, and unwavering insistence on the truth. Justice is earned through evidence, courage, and patience, not position or rank. As Judge Elaine Brooks' case demonstrates, the law did not protect her. Evidence did.